Welcome to panel 3 of the January 2021 conference of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. The theme of this panel is the economic relations between Cuba and the US. I'm Natalia Delgado, and I will be moderating the panel this morning. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. My professional experience is in the private sector, where I was in private practice of law for over 25 years as a corporate and securities lawyer and a partner at Jenner & Block in Chicago. And later, I served for 7 years as the executive of a public company as general counsel. I now direct the Cuba Capacity Building Project at Columbia Law School. It's an initiative designed to foster the development of the legal institutions necessary for Cuba to transition to more of a market-based economy. We have a talented and experienced panel this morning that will discuss aspects of the current economic relations between the two countries and consider the possibilities for the future. I'll tell you more about the backgrounds before each presentation, but let me briefly introduce them now. The first panelist is Paolo Spadoni, who's an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University, who has carried out extensive research on the Cuban economy and the economic impact of US sanctions against Cuba. Our second panelist is Carolyn McCollough, is an international relations PhD candidate at Florida International University, focusing on foreign policy in Latin America. Following Caroline will be Mrinalini Tankha, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Portland State University, who has done field work in Cuba for over 10 years, looking ethnographically at its dual currency system and more recently at the uses of digital payment systems. Then Rick Herrero will join us, who is the executive director of the Cuba Study Group, a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization. And finally, Gary Maybarduk, who is a retired Foreign Service officer and president of the board of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. That's our panel this morning. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes. After all the panelists have presented, we will take questions, and please submit your questions in writing, and we will aim to answer them all before the end of our panel. You won't be allowed to raise your hand, but we welcome your questions. And with that, let me turn it over to Paolo. Thank you for joining.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. As you can see from my PowerPoint, the topic of my presentation will focus on the punitive measure that the Trump administration has implemented toward Cuba since 2017. Let me switch to the next slide. Oops, why doesn't it go? Okay. All right. In June 2017, roughly 6 months into his presidency, Trump said that Obama had negotiated a terrible and misguided deal with Cuba. He promised to do away with the policy of rapprochement of the Obama administration that was launched in 2014, at the end of 2014. So to cancel completely that policy because it was portrayed as a one-sided deal. And he promised to enforce the tourism ban, to enforce embargo restriction, to help Cuban private sector, this is very important, and to practically stop the flow of money going into the coffers of the Cuban military. As we can see later, the first changes were implemented in November 2017, so that's the beginning of the measures that the Trump administration has implemented toward Cuba. What I will do in my presentation in the 10-15 minutes that I have, first, I will talk briefly about the Obama administration's policy toward Cuba, the measures, some of their impact. Then I will focus on Trump's measure, on the economic impact of those measures. Finally, I will talk about some additional factors that impact the Cuban economy, its performance, especially in recent times, and then I will conclude. When it comes to the Obama's measures on Cuba, there have been 6 sets of amendments to sanctions rules after the 17D. The 17D referred obviously to December 17, 2014, which is when Raul Castro and Barack Obama unveiled to the world an agreement they had made on a process toward normalization of relations between the two countries. The key changes that I highlighted here in this slide, first and foremost, independent travel to Cuba under a general license, 12 categories, no tourism ban, but the most important one was the people-to-people general license that at the time that it became individual, practically nullified the tourism ban because you could travel to Cuba under the banner of educational trip that practically included almost everything. Direct commercial flights were initiated, cruises and ferry services were announced, but they were never really started. No limits of remittances, investment that were allowed, especially in the telecommunications sector, with joint ventures for the first time, US companies being eventually engaged in joint ventures in Cuba. Trade with the Cuban private sector, cuentapropistas and cooperatives. And then other additional things. One had to do with the financial transaction, but it never really, the U-turn transaction was never really fully implemented. The rewarding and redefinition of cash in advance for food trade from cash before shipment to cash before transfer of title, and then the modification of the 180-day ship rule under the Torricelli law. If we look at the effect of Obama's measures, they've been quite significant, especially in the area of travel and tourism industry. Over 600,000 US visitors, non-Cuban, I'm referring here because there are two categories. One are the Americans that travel with a Cuban passport and the Cubans who travel with a Cuban passport, even though some older Cubans also travel with a US passport. 600,000 and more in 2017, the resumption of cruise trips in May 2016 with the first trip by Carnival in May of that year. And of course, all of that translated into higher revenues for the Cuban government and above all for the private entrepreneurs of Cuba. One of the key goals, as I said before, of the Trump administration was to support the private sector in Cuba. The Obama policy did do that. Of course, you cannot disassociate the two. If you foster the private entrepreneurs, you also inevitably support the Cuban government in some ways, but it has to be acknowledged that during the Obama administration's time, private entrepreneurs with the influx of US visitors were doing relatively well. In terms of investment, Cuba did become a more appealing investment market. Several business deals with US companies were carried out, especially in the area of telecommunication and travel and tourism. However, by 2015, the initial wave of enthusiasm had given way to a more cautious approach. So the early business deals did not really translate into more business deals later. Now, remittances were up at that time, especially many people were sending money to help their family in Cuba set up small private businesses. Even the debt situation of Cuba, which is quite problematic, had eased a little bit. At that time, more credit was available. Cuba has a traditional liquidity problem, so a chronic problem. But at that time, the economy was doing relatively better, and there was some sign of improvement in the relationship between the two countries and also in the economic performance of the Cuban economy. Here, I only highlighted a couple of slides with figures just to show you don't see much of an increase in terms of Cuban Americans trips to Cuba after 2014 because the restriction on Cuban American family trips were lifted in 2009, early on by the Obama administration. That's why you see more of a bump in terms of increase of non-Cuban trips to Cuba by US citizens. So this is roughly 2017 because the measures of Trump, as I will show you in a moment, were announced in June 2017, the first one, but they were implemented in November 2017. So at least until the end of 2017, there was an increase of trips from the United States to Cuba. Now, I'm showing this slide for a very simple reason, because one of the goals, as I said, of the Trump administration was to help the private sector of Cuba. Under the Obama administration's policy, the private sector of Cuba did indeed improve its situation. If we look at visitor days by sector, as you can see in this figure, 2014, 2017, the visitor days, by the way, they combine a number of visitors with a length of stay. We can see how the proportion between the state and the private sector diminished dramatically. It was roughly 4-to-1 in 2014. It was less than 2-to-1 in 2017, meaning many people traveling to Cuba did stay in casa particulares and in private accommodations. So definitely that helped the private sector. Now, the other part that I also will show you toward the end of my presentation was that the revenues of the private sector nearly doubled in 2014, 2017. There is some debate about how you can really measure that, but the official figures show that was the trend in those 3 years. Now, when it comes to the Trump measures on Cuba, 8 sets of amendments were implemented since November 2017. I'm not going to go through all of that, but the most important one is the first one in terms of travel. First, he reverted to the group travel under the people-to-people banner, and then eventually eliminated the category altogether, meaning if you want to travel to Cuba, as you used to do it before under people-to-people license, you will have to do it with the support for the Cuban people, but it's a different category that entails a different kind of scrutiny, so definitely it's more difficult to do it that way. In May 2019, so there's a time frame between November, almost a year and a half, where really nothing significant happened in terms of changes to the sanctions rules. But in May 2019, he activated Title III of the Helms-Burton that remained dormant since 1996. June 2019, no more the people-to-people travel and the cruise ships. Then, of course, there were more limitations on family remittances, more limitation on charter flights. And finally, in September 2020, there was a limitation on US visitors staying in almost every hotel, something that you would have said it could have happened before. If the idea was to stimulate the private sector in the first place, would have been probably better to ban Americans staying at Cuban hotels early on and foster the accommodation through private entrepreneurs, something that instead it happened, I would say, the other way around. Now, the other thing that also the Trump administration did was to create a list of restricted Cuban entities with which US entities cannot have direct financial transaction. It's very long, the list, but I only highlighted the 2 most important recent additions, FinCEMEX and American International Services, because this is really the addition that led to the end of the Western Union business with Cuba in terms of remittances. And then the last one that just happened a couple of days ago, Banco Financiero Internacional was added to the list. Now, when it comes to Trump's measure, also an impact on Cuba were the sanctions on Venezuelan petroleum industry and also on tankers transporting Venezuelan oil to Cuba, which led to the disruption of oil supplies to Cuba. Then there were sanctions on foreign banks. There was the decision in June 2020 to force Marriott to cease its hotel activities in Cuba. Marriott, for those of you who don't know, is the first US company having an administration contract, hotel administration contract in Cuba. It was the Hotel Quinta Avenida, the former hotel, and now 4 Points by Sheraton. It was ordered to cease its operation because it was not given the renewal of the license in June 2020. And then the Western Union suspension of remittance services on November 2020. Now, when it comes to the impact of Trump's measure, I would say definitely they did have quite an impact. They started slow, but at the end, the impact was significant. In the travel and tourism industry, there was indeed a major reduction of visitor flows to Cuba, as I will highlight in a moment. Less revenues going to the Cuban government, but also less revenues to the private sector. Inevitably, the investment side of the equation, the Helms-Burton law and the activation of Title III did have an impact in lawsuits. There were several, I put it here, 26 Title III lawsuits in the first year, so April 2019 to April 2020, 76 companies involved, 50 American companies, 26 European firms. A lawsuit against Carnival was dismissed in July 2020, and there was practically like a sign that some of those lawsuits cannot really go through. In any case, there was a deterrence to potential foreign investors in Cuba. Several projects that were about to be implemented were actually suspended because of the Helms-Burton and because of the threat. There are other areas of the impact, probably remittances did decline, but here when it comes to remittances, an important aspect also will be the COVID-19 pandemic, as I will say in a moment, that did have an impact on that, especially in 2020. And then the problem that Cuba had to do transactions with foreign banks that were fined by the US, and then the oil supplies to Cuba. Now, I'm putting here a figure when it comes to US visitors, and I'm distinguishing the mode of transportation by air and by sea. As we can see here, in 2017, 2019, US visitors declined by 20%, but US visitors via airplanes declined by 33%, meaning there was an impact quite significant in how many people were traveling to Cuba by air, less by sea, just because the 2017 number does not fully include the suspension of cruises that happened in June 2019. So we can see here it was 200,000 cruise tourists, but that was only the first part of the year. In the second half, there was practically zero. Now, instead, Cuban American visitors did increase 28% during the same period, so the policy was tailored toward Americans of non-Cuban descent, and especially on cruise tourists, but also on visitors by air. Now, this is the number of revenues, I mean, the amount of revenues that the ONA, the Cuban Office of National Statistics, reports. Now, we can have issues with those numbers, where they are fully inclusive or not. But the numbers did show that 2017 was the peak in terms of revenues, and then beginning from that, the revenues of the private sector declined dramatically, which makes sense. So perhaps the number might not be accurate, but the trend, I think it will be. So minus 47% during that same period was the decline of revenues of the private sector related to tourism activities. Now, I also added one slide on foreign direct investment in Cuba. There are no official figures on direct investment in Cuba. The Cuban government has recently, in November 2020, they have the annual trade fair, and the foreign investment and foreign trade minister said that 180 projects worth 7.4 billion had been approved since the enactment of the foreign investment law, the new foreign investment law of Cuba in 2014 until 2020, and more investment were approved in Mariel with more capital involved. However, that mostly referred to the amount of capital that has been, is part of the deal, not to the actual capital that has been delivered to Cuba. The Economist Intelligence Unit has a database. They do include numbers on foreign direct investment, and I just reporting them here. The average annual FDI was 676 million. And why I'm saying it's below target, because Cuba has identified a few years ago between 2 and 2.5 billion in FDI is required by the Cuban economy to sustain a GDP growth annual at least of 5 to 7%. And of course, that target has not been met and is far from being met, even assuming that these numbers are accurate. Now, finally, you cannot really talk just about the impact of Trump's economic measures against Cuba without considering the additional factors that have impacted the Cuban economy in recent years. I say that Cuba has received a sort of triple punch at the same time, not only by Trump, but also the Venezuelan political and economic crisis and the coronavirus pandemic all came at the same time and all had an impact quite significant on the Cuban economy. When it comes to the Venezuelan crisis, the most important impact was the disruption of the oil supplies, but also when it comes to the exports of professional services, medical services in particular, Cuba in Venezuela have declined significantly because of that. And the coronavirus pandemic has practically stopped the tourism industry, disrupted the informal remittance channels. And by this, I mean the mules activities. Of course, if you cannot travel to Cuba, you can also not be able to deliver money, increased shipping costs, and also creating more and more food shortages. And finally, the currency revenues of the Cuban government has declined dramatically, especially in 2020, but even in 2019. And as I will show in my last slide, here is an estimation of 2020, but the rest are official figures. We can see how the Cuban government's access to our currency since 2014 to 2020 has declined significantly. Cuba roughly in 2020 received half of what it received in 2014. And even in the 2020 to 2019, there was a 30% reduction in hard currency revenues. So no wonder the Cuban economy did contract by 11% in 2020, and also did contract for the first time since 1993 by 0.2% in 2019. So there is no doubt that Trump's impact, the measures of Trump had quite an impact, but also the coronavirus pandemic, the Venezuelan crisis, and the systemic shortcomings of the Cuban economy clearly had an impact. Cuba has made an effort to implement new economic reforms. They have announced them last year, and definitely have quite a bit of challenge ahead, the Cuban economy, in order to be able to jumpstart an economy that was already performing bad before the pandemic, before the Venezuelan crisis, and before the Trump's measures really hit the economy. So to conclude, when it comes to the policy of Trump, at the beginning it didn't start very, very strong, but by now we can make an assessment. He did keep his promise to reverse Obama's Cuba policy. If you consider the possibility of including Cuba in the list of terrorist countries, practically almost everything that Obama did was undone by the Obama administration. Even in terms of normal diplomatic relations that are still there, definitely there's way less cooperation right now than there was during the Obama time. So I would say that definitely those measures were indeed, they did follow the promise that Trump made in June 2019. They had a significant negative effect on travel, on investment, on formal and informal remittances, because Western Union had to suspend the remittance services to Cuba, but also informal remittances certainly went down. Oil supplies, banking operation, all those things have been severely compromised by the measures of the Trump administration. So when it comes to the Cuban economy at the end of 2020, it is in a very precarious economic situation, squeezed by all these problems and in need of significant economic reforms. The prospect for 2021, Cuba expects a rebound in economic terms between 5 and 7%, but it will be difficult to achieve under the current condition. They just announced the beginning of the end of the dual monetary system in Cuba, and the implementation of reforms that quite frankly had been announced many years ago and never fully implemented. So it remains to be seen how and when those reforms will be implemented. And also what remains to be seen is what the incoming Biden administration will do with Cuba. If we consider how the election went and how Florida was carried by Trump with a significant amount of votes of Cuban Americans, that might tie the hands of the Biden administration, but there is no doubt that in the short term, they might revert some of the measures that affect Cuban Americans, and eventually down the road also implement some more liberalizing measures for the overall policy toward Cuba. So that's the situation right now, and I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I wanted to add a couple of things with respect to Paolo, since he was the first speaker. I should have mentioned that a little bit more about his background, which is that he received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida, that he holds a laureate in political science from the University of Urbino, Italy, and that he has published widely in scholar and academic venues, and is the author of 2 books on the subject: Cuba's Socialist Economy Today, Navigating Challenges and Change, published in 2014, and Failed Sanctions: Why the US Embargo Against Cuba Could Never Work, published in 2010. So I thank Paolo, and I now would like Caroline to begin to load her slides, but let me say a few things about Caroline. As I mentioned earlier, she is an international relations PhD candidate at FIU with academic and professional experience in the field of foreign affairs. She received a BA from the University of Southern California, and her studies focus on foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean with an emphasis on Cuba. So Caroline will cover the Helms-Burton Act then and now. Thank you, Caroline.
All right, thank you. Let's see, is the video and everything working well? Just to make sure, okay, cool. So yeah, as Dr. Spadoni talked about the Helms-Burton Act a bit and Title III, I'm going to be going a little bit more in depth on sort of the political side of it to, I guess, in a sense, go along with the economic aspects that he talked about. So as Dr. Delgado mentioned, I'm finishing up a PhD at Florida International University. My dissertation is on Cuban American influence on US foreign policy. So if we want to go more into the Cuban American National Foundation or any of that in the question and answer, we can. And so I will also be looking for a non-academic job after I finish in case anybody has some tips, but I will talk about that later. So also one thing I do want to say up front is that I was working as an intern in the State Department in the spring of 2019 when some of these changes were being implemented, and everything that I'm saying here is available publicly. Let's see. Okay, so although the President of the United States has primary jurisdiction over US foreign policy, according to Curtis Wainwright's Supreme Court decision and Constitution, pieces of legislation 6 pieces of legislation constrain the president's ability, or constrain the president's leeway regarding the Cuban embargo. These 6 laws are the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, Cuban Assets Control Regulations of 1963, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, which is also known as the Libertad Act or the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, and the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. So today I will discuss the Helms-Burton Act, which codified the Cuban embargo. First, I will briefly review the events that preceded the Helms-Burton Act. The second section of the presentation will explain the act itself and some of the international responses and domestic. Then I will skim over some of the major events that happened between 1996 and 2019. So I won't be able to do much justice about what went into that, but some of the other presentations can kind of fill that in. And then I'll be discussing the Trump presidency's policies toward Cuba and the end of Title III waivers. Finally, I will discuss the future of the legislation. Let's see. So just very briefly, one thing that when discussing how the Helms-Burton Act came about, it'd be kind of remiss not to mention the Cuban American National Foundation. The Cuban American National Foundation, or CANF, was founded in 1981, kind of with the support of AIPAC, the Israeli, American Israeli lobby. And then, let's see, and the support of the Reagan administration. Jorge Mascanosa and his colleagues founded CANF during Reagan's first term. About a year after the Mariel exodus and all of the drama that went along with that. It became one of the most successful ethnic interest groups in the United States. Early successes included Radio Marti, TV Marti, helping to elect Ileana Ros-Lehtinen to be the first member of the US Congress who was Cuban American, and the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992. CANF worked closely with the Republican, Reagan, and Bush administrations, but the Democratic Clinton administration demonstrated just how influential they could still be in spite of some opposition. They courted people, or CANF courted people on both sides of the aisle, but was generally more effective with Republicans. However, that, as I'm about to describe, that wasn't exclusive. The Cold War ended during George H.W. Bush's presidency, but he ultimately lost his re-election campaign due to the economy. Clinton courted Cuban Americans in the 1992 election against Bush, and his endorsement of the Cuban Democracy Act provided the pressure necessary for Bush to pass the Cuban Democracy Act, despite the hesitations that Bush had shown. Also that year, Bob Menendez in New Jersey and Lincoln Diaz-Balart in South Florida were elected to the US House of Representatives alongside Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. Cuba's economy crashed crashed with the end of the Cold War and Soviet subsidies, resulting in the special period. Tens of thousands of desperate Cubans set sail in makeshift rafts headed for Florida. The Balsero crisis of 1994 and what followed consumed much of Clinton's first term. His administration negotiated the 1994 and 1995 migration accords in response to the Balsero crisis. Let's see. His decision to return interdicted Cubans to Cuba, also known as the wet foot, dry foot policy, infuriated Cuban Americans. CANF had already begun crafting harsher legislation with sympathetic Republicans after Republicans won back Congress in 1994. The Helms-Burton bill was the result. The Helms-Burton Act would codify the embargo, which, as you could kind of see before when I was talking about the different pieces of legislation, is still to a degree piecemeal, but the Helms-Burton Act is the bulk of it at this point. Let's see, the Helms-Burton Act had several costs and benefits, which supporting it would give greater access to Cuban American support. So meaning Cuban American votes in Florida as a swing state in presidential election year, political donations, congressional support. It would signal a commitment to dissidents and democracy on the island. It would aim to cut off the cash supply to the Cuban regime. However, public opinion was continuously changing about the embargo because by then it was already about 36 years old, give or take a few years. So it was broadly unpopular with the American public at large. And some Cuban American attitudes were starting to change, but that would really start to change more so after Elian Gonzalez. It caused problems with international alliances and allowed other countries to kind of fill the void where US influence could be. They were afraid it would, that some of the right to sue provisions would overwhelm US courts, and I probably should put feed anti-US rhetoric, which it helps to feed into the anti-US rhetoric that the Cuban administration uses, just as a kind of catch-all blame or scapegoat, I guess. Let's see. I lost my place for a second there. Okay, so Clinton, because of all these costs and benefits, and one of the other costs, of course, was that the Helms-Burton Act, the way it was written, it put ending the embargo into the hands of Congress more so than into the hands of the president, even though the president usually has primary jurisdiction over US foreign policy. So it kind of undermined his or the president's ability to navigate Cuban foreign policy. So Clinton was very hesitant to support it. Of course, that all changed after 4 US nationals or pilots were shot down over international waters in February 1996. And these pilots were part of the humanitarian Brothers to the Rescue organization. After that, Clinton didn't really have much choice but to retaliate somehow. And so he passed the Helms-Burton Act in March. The Helms-Burton Act has 4 main sections. The Title I concerns third countries and international institutions. So what to do when other countries other than the United States and Cuba are supporting Cuba, and what to do regarding support of Cuba within international organizations. The second act outlines the requirements for assisting Cuba in terminating the embargo. The third, or Title III, includes the right to sue entities that traffic in confiscated Cuban property, and Title IV denies US entry to individuals who traffic in confiscated US property and their families. Let's see. So, however, by the time that President Clinton signed the act, because there were issues with allies who were concerned about their companies in their countries who were investing in Cuba, the Congress and the president managed to agree to allow for 6-month waivers. So at any given time, so essentially since Clinton signed the Helms-Burton Act, every 6 months, like clockwork, presidents have enacted the waiver for Title III's right to sue up until 2019. So despite all of this, Canada, the European Union, Mexico, and other places condemned the passage of the Helms-Burton Act because of the extraterritorial aspects of it. They created blocking statutes in response to protect their businesses. The European Union, the European Union brought a complaint before the the World Trade Organization, the US and the EU had to negotiate a memorandum of understanding to resolve their disputes. And European Union also negotiated a common position for Cuba. Let's see, so even though Title III has been waived every 6 months to kind of help resolve some of these issues, Title IV actually never was waived, which is kind of a common misconception when you read some of the articles about it. As Representative Lincoln Diaz-Balart mentioned or said, the message is clear. They are going to have to choose between collaborating with Castro or participating in the US market. And he's referring to companies in third countries, essentially. So that was really the primary aim of the Helms-Burton Act, and the biggest change that it made to the Cuban embargo. So some of the biggest reasons why the Helms-Burton Act matters is because it codified the embargo, it limited the president's control over foreign policy, and it possibly contradicted international norms and laws according to how you read it and I guess your ideology. So some of those would be, of course, extraterritoriality, sovereignty, whatever, jurisdiction, and active state, which it directly addresses. So yeah. So after the Helms-Burton Act, a ton of stuff happened. I don't really have time to go into a lot of it, but some of the other talks can kind of help fill in those gaps. CANF split after Jorge Mascanosa died, and the Elian Gonzalez incident stretched their capacities and competing visions. New organizations arose like the Cuba Study Group, Cuba Liberty Council, and the U.S.-Cuba Democracy PAC. Cuban American legislators multiplied in U.S. Congress and gained greater prestige. Many Cuban Americans also held political appointments. Cuban American public opinion became less isolationist toward Cuba. So you can kind of see, if you look at the public polling, you can see some of the attitudes changing regarding traveling back to Cuba, the embargo, remittances, and so on. Of course, and then of course, there was Obama's thaw, the 17D thaw, that began to normalize relations with Cuba. By the time, that's 20 years worth of US-Cuba relations before Trump, in which the Helms-Burton Act remained rather stagnant, but determined the policy. And so that kind of gives some of the look. And okay, so Trump credited his 2016 Florida win to Cuban Americans, especially the Bay of Pigs Veterans Association that endorsed him in October 2016. He put many hardliners on his transition team and in political appointments. Alexander Acosta became labor secretary, a member of his cabinet. Marco Rubio and Mario Diaz-Balart worked closely with the administration to determine Latin American and Caribbean policy, especially Cuban and Venezuelan. Within 6 months, Trump announced that he would undo many of Obama's policies. And in 2018, John Bolton became National Security Advisor, and Mauricio Claver-Carron of the U.S.-Cuba Democracy PAC became his deputy. All viewed Cuba as intrinsic to the crisis in Venezuela. And so the other things that were happening along with Venezuela, which the previous speaker spoke about, Fidel died in 2016, Raul stepped down from presidency in 2018, Miguel Diaz-Canel became the new president, and China and Russia started investing more again. In this environment, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo enabled the enforcement of Title III starting in May 2019. The EU, Canada, Mexico, China, Russia, Cuba, and others condemned the action. US allies threatened retaliation, but it was still unclear how the law would play out in US courts, given questions of international law and jurisdiction. Contrary to expert estimations of thousands of lawsuits, there were only about 25 suits in the first year, or 26. Many were dismissed, and the majority have been against US entities. Aspects that have limited the suits
I've lost volume. I can't hear anything.
Oh, shit. You can't hear me right now?
I can't hear Caroline.
It may just be Natalia.
You can hear me then? Okay. All right. I won't plug that back in. So many of these lawsuits were dismissed. The majority have been against US entities as opposed to third country entities. And aspects of limited the suits include burden of proof, the stipulation that the property must be worth at least $50,000, questions of jurisdiction, interpretation of the exemptions, and so on. Contrary to the express purpose, Title III enforcement has not resulted in appreciable divestment, but there have been a few settlements.
I can't hear anything.
Determining the
Hello?
degree of its impact on initial investments.
Caroline, I think you are running out of time. If you could wrap up these things.
Yeah, so I'm just finishing up here. Determining the degree of how it affected initial investments would take more work, and yeah, previous guy talked about it. So a lot of the changes were overestimated, but it's the aspects of Helms-Burton are still going to be with us for a long time, just because of all the requirements that are all of the requirements to get rid of it. So, and I'll just stop there. So does Dr. Delgado, did she hit the volume on her own computer?
Hello?
You guys said that you can hear me, right? Okay, let's try chat.
You can hear me. Okay, because I can't hear a thing. Okay, thanks. Okay, let me go ahead. Caroline, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I cannot hear anybody at the moment, but I understand that you can hear me. So let me just thank you for your remarks, and let me introduce our next speaker, and then hopefully this audio problem will get resolved. Our next speaker is Mrinalini Tankha. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at Portland State University. She did her PhD in anthropology at Brandeis University and also has a BA in economics and an MA in sociology from the University of Delhi in India. Prior to joining Portland State University, she was a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion at the University of California in Irvine. Her research highlights how specific histories, politics, morality, and value systems affect the uses and meanings of money in different societies. She has done fieldwork in Cuba for over 10 years, looking ethnographically at its dual currency system and more recently on the uses of digital payment systems. So thank you and welcome, Mrinalini, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Natalia. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Natalia and Larry, for putting this panel together, and many thanks to all of you who are tuned in this morning. So first off, as Natalia mentioned, I'm an economic anthropologist, so most of my work is based on ethnographic research, and what I'm going to present today are some findings from research I've been conducting since about 2016 on the payment and money transfer infrastructures of digital and e-commerce platforms that more and more Cubans began using at the time as internet penetration slowly started to increase. So I've been investigating the sort of benefits and also the challenges of operating on these platforms, particularly due to the effects of US sanctions on global finance and their effects on the ways international transactions are settled. So today I'm going to focus on Airbnb transactions and cryptocurrency transactions. So with global trends towards digitizing commerce and financial services, several online platforms also entered the Cuban market. So formal value transfer services such as Ding, emerged for diaspora Cubans to remotely recharge mobile airtime and top up Nauta Wi-Fi credits for their family on the island. To compete with the Mula career agencies, major supermarkets in Havana and in other provinces also created online marketplaces linking agencies such as U.S Cuba that enabled kin abroad to select and pay for items in local stores that could then get delivered to their families in Cuba. These are some examples of how this began. Then American online brokers such as Airbnb also entered the Cuban market as US sanctions against Cuba loosened under the Obama administration in 2015. And at the time, there was sort of limited internet on the island, and many Airbnb accounts for rentals in Cuba were managed by overseas relatives or sort of well-to-do listing agents with more regular high-speed internet who could respond in a timelier fashion to reservation requests and questions from guests and things like that. But with no US-Cuba direct banking relations, electronic payments for reservations made on US-based sites like Airbnb could not be deposited directly into individual Cuban bank accounts. So Cubans listing with Airbnb either themselves had foreign bank accounts or had friends and family members with foreign bank accounts to receive the online payments, or they would get cash payments delivered to them in Cuba from a third-party remittance service contracted by Airbnb, such as Cuba. As Paolo already mentioned, under the Obama administration, one of the things that happened was that licensed US banking institutions were allowed to process US dollar monetary instruments presented by Cuban financial institutions and open correspondent accounts with Cuban banks to process authorized transactions and to enroll Cuban merchants to accept US credit and debit cards as well. US banking institutions were also authorized, as Paolo mentioned, to process U-turn transactions related to Cuba. And what, in other words, that's fund transfers from a bank outside of the United States could pass through US financial institutions before being transferred to a bank outside of the United States, even when neither party was subject to US jurisdiction. So this facilitated non-US companies' ability to engage in US dollar transactions involving Cuba. And these U-turn transactions were eliminated by the Trump administration in 2019. So the shifts in banking relations under Obama were facilitated by removing Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list that, of course, Mike Pompeo is threatening to reverse. And again, as Paolo mentioned, just a few days ago, the State Department added the military-controlled Banco Financiero Internacional to the Cuba restricted list, leaving all major airlines like JetBlue, like Delta, like American that transact with BFI to find alternative ways to process their financial transactions. So in fact, Airbnb chose not to set up a correspondent account in a Cuban bank precisely because of this kind of uncertainty and unpredictability, as well as for fear of being fined by the US government for violating the Helms-Burton Act, despite changes introduced by the Obama administration. And matters came to a head in 2019 when President Trump activated the controversial Title III of the Helms-Burton Act that allows US nationals to sue in federal court any entity trafficking in formerly American-owned properties confiscated by the Castro government. Under this new provision, the family of the former owners of Banco Núñez, one of the banks nationalized by Fidel Castro, sued French bank Société Générale for doing business with the Central Bank of Cuba. Several other companies, including American Airlines, Amazon, and Melia, have since been slapped with lawsuits by Americans claiming ownership to properties in Cuba. So the repercussions of these longer bilateral histories and unsettled transnational debts and property claims critically impact the ways that infrastructures that are tasked with processing and settling payments, how they can actually function and how efficient they can be. So in my research, I was interested in the experiences of owners of casas particulares in processing payments when listing with Airbnb. So most of the hosts who used Airbnb to receive payouts were dissatisfied due to delayed payments for several months and the amounts ranging from 200 CUC to 1500 CUC. And, many also complained about how the payouts they received often didn't match the amounts reflected in their Airbnb accounts, and how they also lost money in currency conversion from US dollar to CUC. Several Cuban hosts also expressed frustration at receiving lump sum payments from Airbnb without clear payment memos or breakdown of earnings from different bookings. Even more affluent Cubans, though, with foreign bank accounts and even foreign travelers to Cuba, were not necessarily completely immune to the fragility of these payment infrastructures. So take, for instance, one of my interlocutors, Ricardo, an affluent listing agent who managed several, Ricardo is a pseudonym, so an affluent listing agent who managed several rental properties on Airbnb. He had a bank account in Panama linked to his Airbnb profile. And so in addition to making a commission on each rental, he also used the platform to informally engage in currency exchange to circumvent both US sanctions and the taxes levied by the Cuban government on USD transactions in Cuba. So Ricardo offered to convert US dollars to CUC at a better rate. So one US dollar to 0.93 CUC than the currency bureaus, which was $1 US to 0.87 kooks. So for one of his guests, right, an American journalist, Amy, who was staying at one of his properties. He suggests using the Airbnb platform, which allows guests to transfer money to hosts without any fees for incidentals, for extra charges that guests incur during their stay and for what are termed experiences. So Ricardo assured Amy that since their Airbnb accounts were already linked, the payments would clear, even though they were being initiated in Havana. Amy sent a request to transfer $537 US to his account on Airbnb, and he paid her out 500 CUC in cash in Havana. So the US dollars were deposited straight into Ricardo's Panamanian bank account, allowing him to avoid the hassle of having to change CUC to US dollars when he traveled abroad. And so this transaction cleared, and Ricardo and Amy decided to repeat this, where he paid her 930 CUC in cash, and she requested Airbnb to transfer $1,000 US to his account. But it wasn't until Amy returned to the United States that she realized that the second transaction had been flagged and halted. So she was now in the United States, but she still owed Ricardo $1,000 US. Unfazed, Ricardo sort of said to Amy that, hey, Amy, you're a journalist. I know you're buena gente. Tenemos confianza. You're not going to disappear with my money. I'm not worried. So Amy called Airbnb, and they said the transaction had been flagged as suspicious because it was the second payment initiated in Cuba, and they required more details. So Amy told Airbnb that the payment was for excursions and car rentals, which fell within the purview of travel-related services Airbnb was authorized to provide under sanction regulations. But many weeks passed with no resolution from Airbnb. By this time, Ricardo had an urgent need for the money, so he and Amy decided to use another channel to ensure he got the cash. Amy deposited the money in the Wells Fargo bank account of his cousin who lived in Miami. She then called Airbnb to cancel the $1,000 US transfer that she was then assured would be taken care of in a couple of business days. But a few weeks later, Amy noticed that Airbnb had in fact transferred the $1,000 to Ricardo. So now he owed Amy $1,000. So Ricardo and Amy had to make several calls to Airbnb till Amy received her refund 2 months later. So what we see here is that because of US sanctions, because these transactions get flagged, what happens, it creates blockages and delays in settling electronic payments, compelling a resort to more traditional in-person brick and mortar banking services to complete transactions in a somewhat timelier manner. The transacting parties also have to mobilize multiple what are called monetary ecologies, cash, credit cards, checks, and initiate transactions in different geographical locations to ensure the settlement of accounts. But moreover, this sort of refashioning and repurposing of payment infrastructures hinges on informal relationships, right? Based on confianza, based on impressions of being buena gente, and forms of cultural capital, like being a journalist. So this is reminiscent of socialismo, or networks of trusted socios operating in the on-ground informal economy. At every stage in the sequence of events that I just mentioned, confianza between the multiple parties counteracts the obstructions in the payment infrastructures that at any point could have yielded a default in payment. So electronic payment infrastructures are therefore sort of propped up by what are termed social infrastructures, where people mobilize a complex of technologies, spaces, relationships through a collaborative practice that, that carry both traces of past relationships, but also a willingness to transact in new and novel ways. So here it's the histories of informality and engaging in socialismo and perceptions of confianza that produce this social infrastructure upon which these new interactions with digital payments, with digital platforms and electronic payment ecologies get built. And they are really ultimately what drive the accounts to be settled. So, with the expansion of the internet on the island, some Cubans have also turned to investing and trading in cryptocurrency as a way to skirt US economic sanctions and access global financial markets and online retail marketplaces. So programmers and other IT professionals also use cryptocurrency as a way to work in the global economy and get compensated for their labor. Brazil-based startup Fusiona, one of the few Bitcoin exchanges serving Cubans, had nearly 700 registered accounts since its launch in 2018. Alex Sobrino, founder of Cuba Crypto, estimated that around 10,000 Cubans were using cryptocurrencies. In April 2020, an Italian-Cuban entrepreneur, Mario Mazzola, launched Cubita, Cuba's first peer-to-peer Bitcoin exchange. Even Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel announced in July 2019 that the government was exploring the use of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency to boost the economy, which was severely crippled by the collapse of Venezuela and tightened US sanctions under President Trump. More recently, with Western Union suspending US remittance transfers to Cuba, as well as the kind of assumed volatility accompanying currency unification, there's been a rise in the use of cryptocurrencies as both a medium of exchange and a store of value. Now, similar to Airbnb, crypto wallets cannot be linked to Cuban bank accounts. So Cubans either have people abroad to on-ramp their wallets with installments of cryptocurrency, or they purchase cryptocurrency in person from networks of local traders in Cuba in exchange for cash. Eric Garcia, a software engineer, launched another startup recently, this past September, called BitRemesas. BitRemesas is a platform that allows remittances to be sent to friends and family in Cuba in a variety of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ether, Dash. And in the past few weeks, BitRemesas launched a new feature allowing diaspora Cubans, or anyone really abroad, to pay utility bills for people in Cuba in cryptocurrency. So, cryptocurrencies operate in a somewhat gray zone of legality in Cuba because there isn't any clear regulation around them. And so things are possible that precisely because there's nothing strictly laid out about how the government responds to cryptocurrencies. However, since there's no direct linkage to crypto wallets, there's no direct linkage between crypto wallets and banks or utility companies in Cuba, startups like BitRemesas accept remittances in crypto and charge a fee for processing the transaction, and then they make payments out to individuals or to the utility companies in cash or through Transfer Móvil, which is a Texas mobile application for making online payments. So BitRemesas has recruited a network of programmers and software engineers through word of mouth that operates somewhat like agents responsible for verifying each transaction. And in the process, these agents can gain a bit of commission in cryptocurrency. So the important thing to note here is that this distributed crypto platform also functions a little bit like socialismo, right? Based on a social infrastructure of agents of confianza, since again, there's no legal recourse for payments being stalled or canceled. Now, while cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin propose that one must simply trust the code or the cryptographic algorithm that secures global anonymous transactions, in Cuba, there's currently little use for these technologies as a means of payment, unless they are undergirded by these cash infrastructures or these social infrastructures of trust. So while these transactions are currently restricted largely to communities of like tech savvy programmers, or as Eric Garcia put it to me, a community of geeks, he expects this to slowly expand to a more general population, especially as Cubans feel the effects of inflation with the currency unification, and as the price of Bitcoin rises further and is projected to increase threefold. Now, there are several ways that US sanctions impinge even on the circulation of this so-called anti-state, decentralized, peer-to-peer cryptocurrency exchange in Cuba. Bitcoin aims to undercut the power of intermediaries, such as banks and credit card companies that charge exorbitant fees and rely on centralized entities like the automated clearinghouse operated by the Federal Reserve, and credit card networks like MasterCard and Visa to authenticate transactions and settle payments. But private third-party providers processing Bitcoin payments, such as Coinbase, Bitfinex, and Binance, are all bound by US sanction regulations and compelled to flag and detain electronic payments initiated in what they call a prohibited country, like Cuba. Even many non-US based cryptocurrency exchanges reinforce these exclusions by geo-blocking trades initiated in Cuba and other countries considered prohibited by US sanctions. The irony, however, is that these non-US based crypto exchanges also geo-block US citizens and trades initiated in the United States, not because of sanctions, but to avoid compliance with US regulatory restrictions in place to protect its citizens against fraudulent activities. Now, several of the Cubans I spoke with and I interviewed, spoke of having to use virtual private networks, VPNs, to bypass both the Cuban government's close monitoring of internet activity and censorship of particular websites, and to hide their locations and IP addresses so that they are not geo-blocked from accessing private cryptocurrency exchanges. Many had unhosted crypto wallets or were registered with exchanges that had less strict know your customer or KYC requirements. However, this is an extremely precarious position in the event that that they get locked out of their accounts, or they have to produce identity documents. For instance, one of my interlocutors, Neil, an American blockchain enthusiast from New York, visited Havana to attend a technology conference. So without setting up a VPN, he connected to a public Wi-Fi network in Havana on his phone and accessed his Coinbase account to check the price of Bitcoin and Ether, the main cryptocurrencies he was trading in. To his surprise, he had been locked out of his Coinbase wallet. Coinbase is a leading cryptocurrency exchange headquartered in San Francisco. Now, upon returning to New York, Neil contacted Coinbase's online customer support. They responded saying that he had attempted to log into his Coinbase account from a country in which Coinbase is prohibited by law from doing business per the sanctions imposed by the OFAC. Now, Coinbase assures its customers that their access will be reinstated when they log on from a non-prohibited region and they verify their identity. So Neil submitted his US passport as evidence of his citizenship, as well as a utility bill as proof of residence to Coinbase. 1 month passed with no action from Coinbase, despite countless emails and frantic calls from Neil. It was now the middle of December 2017. The price of Bitcoin was soaring and reached its then all-time high at $19,891 US on December 17th, and then crashed and fell to $6,000 US on February 6, 2018. Neil was still locked out of his Coinbase wallet with no recourse, unable to sell any of his Bitcoin. So Coinbase only reinstated his access 3 months later. Now, while Neil suffered a tremendous financial loss, he was able to regain access to his account. But Cubans in a similar position would not be granted that same privilege. So these, alleged distributed crypto infrastructures do not escape the caprices of state-led geopolitics, and paradoxically end up centralizing and territorializing risk that is disproportionately borne by people hailing from or initiating transactions from what are imagined to be prohibited corners of the globe. So Cuba was at the time no longer on the US State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism and had been found at low risk for money laundering and terrorist financing by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, an international intergovernmental regulatory institution governed largely by G7 nations. Now, as an anthropologist, Annalise Riles notes, the separation of entirely private conduct and state action is something of a fiction, precisely because at some point, private rules are always dependent upon legal institutions for their state legal institutions for their enforcement, making the technical protocols of financial markets deeply political. So Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies thereby cannot entirely circumvent the lingering histories and haunting effects of US sanctions and continue to be intimately intertwined with the political economies and entrenched exclusions enforced by more centralized US state and international regulatory institutions. So to conclude here, I know I'm a little over time. I've tried to show how financial transactions between the US and Cuba are governed by these sort of interconnected technical and social infrastructures that work to channel and settle, but also to obstruct and delay electronic payments across borders. Now, these dense histories of the US embargo against Cuba that is itself a product of unsettled debts and property claims sort of, clogs the networks of these payment infrastructures. Settlements then are linked across scales and temporalities with everyday sort of real payment settlements hinging on these protracted political histories between the US and Cuban governments. And electronic payment infrastructures therefore have to be propped up and secured by pre-existing cash infrastructures that engage in repairing these breakages and delays and fallouts of an interoperable banking system. And Cubans' experiences challenge the promise of digital payments being more inclusive and speedy and secure, particularly when their settlements, even on decentralized crypto platforms, can be detained by the edicts of US geopolitics, both in the sense of being held back, but also being criminalized. So more broadly, I think this demonstrates an urgent need for proponents of digital futures to reckon with the past, with politics, and with power, and recognize the way that these infrastructures of cashlessness are entrenched in these global neoliberal economies that distribute risk and forms of precarity inequitably and unevenly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrinalini, for that presentation. I know Gary has a question of you, which he can ask at the end in the question and answer section, because next we need to hear from him. Let me say a little bit about Gary. Gary is a PhD economist. He's a retired Foreign Service officer from the State Department and a member of the board of ASCE. Actually, he's our president. He has been writing on the Cuban economy since 1999, when he was a counselor for economic and political affairs in the US interest section in Havana. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Gary, who will present next about how, I guess, the future, really, his presentation is about future relations.
Thank you. It's going to give me a second here to set up again. Okay, just a second. I'm still working here. Sorry. You've got to I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so all you're going to get from me is a title, and you're going to have to listen carefully. Okay, so let me minimize this. Get out of the way. Okay. Encouraging Cuba's economic reforms. Can America help? Cuba and the United States are entering a new era. The perfect storm that has engulfed the Cuban economy, the loss of Venezuelan aid, and the loss of tourism, the tightened embargo restrictions of the Trump administration, which we just talked about, have caused the Cuban government to rethink their economic model. On the US side, the inauguration of a new administration with a jaundiced view of Trump policies will be looking for an innovative approach. Working against any kind of reapproachment are the perpetual issues of Cuba's refusal to deal with human rights abuses, the Cuban economy, American community's hostility to positive gestures, or at least part of the community, Cuba's involvement in Venezuela, and the attack on American diplomats in Havana. On the Cuban side, their authorities' desire to maintain power, their determination to protect sovereignty and objections to any quid pro quo makes negotiations highly problematic. Although both sides need to do a serious rethink of their options, this paper will focus on the American side. Encouraging economic reform in Cuba will require a clarity and precision of thought that has been lacking in the Cuban policies of recent administrations. The Biden administration will need an understanding of the dynamic forces that have prevented serious reforms since Raul Castro first promoted them at the Sixth Party Congress in 2010, at the Seventh Party Congress in 2016, and the constitutional process in 2018. It should understand why Obama's effort to promote the private sector in Cuba backfired. Domestically, it will need to find ways to discourage the partisanship that plagues any U.S. policy towards Cuba. Americans, including this author, have long tended to think that the vibrant private sector would push Cuba to a more dramatic society. China and Vietnam, of course, have been the counterexamples. However, the Cubans understand and agree with our views. In the Seventh Party Congress, Raul Castro was very clear on this point. He observed that, quote, depending on the predominance of one form of ownership over another, a country's social system is determined. Yet when American leaders generate new initiatives to encourage the private sector in Cuba, they must justify their actions to the American public as necessary to bring change in Cuba. It is what politicians do in a democratic society. But it's actually bad policy that strengthens resistance in Cuba. It is a Gordian knot that hampers change. So, is there an opportunity? For over a decade, this author and some others have argued that the political culture of Cuba was so highly resistant to change that it would take at least one more generational shift in the leadership of the party and the government before progress could be made. The perfect storm may have changed that conclusion. At least the planned economic reforms announced last summer may allow for reconsideration. With numerous pages written on the barriers to change in Cuba, and many speakers having spoken on it already here, it is not necessary to dwell on the details. A quick summary, however, will inform our discussion. Chief among the barriers to change is the senior leadership's fear of the loss of power. For this reason, senior leadership has long resisted stabilization programs, which they refer to as shock therapy. Rising prices of food and other essential goods, which has already happened, as well as the loss of thousands of public service jobs, which may happen, threatens the regime. And the current effort at reform may well fail from the inability, the Cuban government's inability to police, to police the inflationary process it has already generated. Broad privatization and the accumulation of wealth allow for new centers of power in an otherwise centrally controlled economy. That can be seen in the constitutional reform process. Prior to the final revisions of the Constitution, there had been broad debate in the party about preventing an accumulation of wealth. Fidel Castro's own objections against wealth accumulation led to the abandoning of agriculture reform in the 1980s, and his objections have stuck. Yet when the penultimate draft of the Constitution explicitly banned wealth accumulation, the private entrepreneurs strongly objected at a meeting with party leaders and led to the and the language was weakened to allow some wealth accumulation. The expansion of the private sector has led to the beginnings of a civil society, which in itself is a threat to the regime. It must be a worry to party ideologues. The loss of control is also feared by the bureaucracy, members of state corporations, and lower level party members. And we had an excellent paper on Cuban bureaucracy in the first session, which I think is very important. Unable to regulate and prevent licensing of cuenta propicias of small business owners, or to run state corporations, those cadres risk losing status, jobs, and income. Despite two rewrites of the Foreign Investment Code and numerous statements by senior officials on the need for foreign investment, foreign investors have found it impossible, almost impossible, to get through the approval process or even get to an answer on the status of their applications. Ideology is also a severe hindrance to change. Even as the Cuban model has failed, the search for fresh solutions must overcome an ideology developed by the leader of the revolution, Fidel Castro. Just as Western economists, myself included, start viewing a problem from the classic, perfect free market models, and then must struggle to find solutions to pressing problems such as income inequality and global warming, so too must Cuban economists and political leaders struggle to get past the ideology that has been inoculated into them since childhood. That struggle is evident in the declarations of both the 6th and 7th Party Congresses and in the constitutional debates, where conflicting views were clearly evident. Finally, there was an important policy change introduced into Cuba by Raul Castro of a decade ago, democratization of the party. And this is an issue that I think has been largely missed by other analysts. In the long term, this may prove to be a significantly positive change that will spread to the rest of society. For the past decade, however, it has provided the more conservative party members a means to successfully resist and undermine reforms advocated by the leadership. And Raul Castro himself has mentioned that. Despite the economic process, that may continue. So how do we proceed? First with a drink. The Biden administration will need to set priorities. It will need to decide if it can improve relations with Cuba, while the regime continues to punish any opposition and continues to support Maduro in Venezuela. It will need to decide if it can restore normal staffing levels to our embassy without some resolution to the attacks on our diplomats. This paper does not purport to examine those issues, except to make the author's personal observation that the first two would be highly unlikely to meet with any success. The regime's stability depends on preventing any serious opposition from even starting, and views Venezuelan oil, even in diminished qualities, if in fact they are diminished, key to its survival. The attack on our diplomats is more complex. It was most likely carried out by the Russians. It's Putin's style, and he is the one most likely to have had incentive to do so. That said, the Cuban government, if they did not know about the event before, probably know about what happened since, and needs to make clear they will do everything in their power to prevent it in the future. Until we are sure of their commitment, our embassy staff should continue to be minimal, except for the analytical officers who can help keep a critical eye on the events on the island. Domestically, the Biden team should try to discourage making Cuba policy a domestic issue. This is almost an impossibility, but it needs to be tried. Continued consultation with Congress, a priori consultation with Congress, and the Republican opposition should help inch both sides to a mutual understanding of means and goals. On economic policy, the administration should move slowly and carefully. For humanitarian reasons, they should lift restrictions on remittances and travel of Cuban Americans to visit family on the islands. This relieves some of the acute stress on the Cuban economy, but with the bulk of the money going to families and cuentapropistas for investment, it should help the private sector. Our current policy on remittances and family travel are inimical to our own interests. After that, we should tell the Cubans that we intend to follow a policy of constructive engagement. We will not trample on the Cuban notion of sovereignty, which is always a losing cause. Nor will we change our own policies in hopes for or a promise of change. Instead, we should follow their policies, and when the Cuban government decides on reforms that build a modern economy based on individual initiative and free markets, we should alter our embargo to support those specific moves. An example would be a policy towards the current devaluation and the end of the dual currency system. It is a much needed reform, but it's far from certain that it will go far enough. The maintenance of price controls, the blocking of bank accounts, and the policy of not selling dollars to the public is going to lead to a chaotic situation. It will make it hard for the country's export or import subsistence industries to respond to new market incentives that the devaluation is supposed to engender. It is difficult to imagine how the US could respond to this effort. The Cuban government has also allowed private sector entities to import and export directly, although they must do so through government intermediaries and subject their source of funds to a review by a designated bank, and that's the FSI bank, which the Trump administration has now cut off. The problem, again, is that the government feels it must maintain control. However, should the government decide to eliminate those forced intermediaries and allow private firms to buy dollars, then the American government could loosen the embargo to allow trading with those private businessmen. For many years, the Cuban government has prohibited the private sector from importing capital goods, even a mixmaster, as I discovered, for a private baker. It is not clear to me if that ban has been lifted. The American government should allow those exports to Cuba, whether sold or sent as gifts from Cuban Americans. In the agricultural sector, the Cuban government now allows farmers to deliver their own produce to the market, either with their own trucks or private truckers. The Cuban government has gone back and forth on this policy over the decades, as it strove to protect the acopios and the government's own food distribution system. The government shipping monopoly has led wastage in farm-to-market distribution. U.S. policy already allows the sale of farm inputs to Cuba, but a loosening of the remittance policy could allow Cuban-American families to send the farm equipment directly to their own farm families in Cuba, including trucks. It would be a win-win solution for everyone, including the Cuban consumers and the Cuban government. Currently, U.S. policy does now allow supplier financing of our exports to Cuba. Given Cuba's continued record of defaults, U.S. policy makes sense. We should not want U.S. government guaranteed deposit institutions to risk their capital in Cuba. However, if Cuba were to open foreign exchange markets where everybody could buy and sell foreign currencies, then the American could allow supplier credit to the private market. Currently, the U.S. prohibits most American investment in Cuba. Foreign investors must find their employees through government agencies. Those agencies may also fire those employees without consulting the firm. Wages are taxed at the 85 to 95% level. So many firms pay the workers a side benefit that often escapes taxation. It is not a system the US government can endorse. However, if the Cuban government were to allow foreign firms to hire and fire whomever they wish, within the reasonable regulations of international labor conventions, to which Cuba belongs, and if taxes on wages were reduced to reasonable levels, then the USG could permit American investment in Cuba. I know, getting their time, got it. If Cuban current reform efforts move forward in search of greater efficiency, there should be more opportunities for constructive engagement. I must say I remain a skeptic that many such reforms will be taken to the logical conclusions. Nevertheless, when it happens, there should be a reward. In the meantime, there is no reason to hurry. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. I know you have a question for one of the other panelists. I just wanted to remind the panelists that you can ask questions of each other at the end. But we still need to hear from Ricardo Herrero. And let me tell you about him before he begins, a little bit more than I said at the beginning. Rick Herrero is the executive director of the Cuba Study Group, a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization comprised of Cuban American business leaders and young professionals who share a vision of a free, sovereign, inclusive, and prosperous Cuba that provides opportunities for all of its citizens to fulfill their aspirations. He is a strategic communications and public affairs professional with close to 2 decades of experience at working at the intersection of international relations, politics, media, and philanthropy. With that, I turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you all for joining us today. I was a late addition to this panel and don't have a paper to share, but do have comments that I wish to share, somewhat synthesizing what many of our excellent panelists have been speaking about over the last hour and a half or so. So the focus of my remarks will be on US-Cuba private sector engagement, both the merits and missed opportunities. And this is really focusing on the years where private sector engagement and empowerment were seen as a policy priority on the US side. So sort of the Obama years, particularly the last 2 of the second term. The Trump administration did leave intact those Obama era authorizations that allowed for trade with the Cuban private sector, as well as for investment in projects that would support the Cuban people and drive non-state independent activity. However, supporting that sector really took a backseat way in the rear of the bus to maximum pressure sanctions against the Cuban government and military. So let's go a little bit back in time now to the years where we really saw unprecedented private sector growth in Cuba, particularly during 2011 and 2017. We saw that this was largely as a response to the realineamientos and the recognition by the Cuban government that they had to let go of its state payrolls by at least 1 million employees and try to have the private sector absorb all that human capital. It didn't get to 1 million, but we did see that by 2016, the private sector was employing more than 500,000 Cubans on the island. This private sector was largely supported by hundreds of thousands of US travelers and other foreign travelers dating back to 2011, who helped fuel the expansion of the sector, benefiting thousands of livelihoods, since they're the ones on the island, these visitors who really had the purchasing power in order to allow these private sector entrepreneurs to sell their goods and services and grow, and many of them thrive. When you add private farmers, employees of joint ventures, and other informal sector workers, both part and full time, You saw Cuba's non-state sector reach a point where it was accounting for more than 1/3 of the Cuban labor force on the island. And we saw American travelers and partners again really help it turn into the most dynamic job-producing sector in Cuba, particularly in 2015 and 16. Other merits of private sector engagement, remittances, family remittances, donative remittances, and other forms of remittances did provide a key startup capital for Cuban private sector growth, even though this was informal and was not recognized as investment by Cuban law. This allowed for the further integration of Cubans at home with those abroad, since it was in many cases those abroad that were providing that seed capital for those Cuban small businesses to launch. We saw partnerships with U.S. universities, NGOs, and cultural institutions help propel the growth and diversification of Cuba's civil society, not just in the private business sector with business incubation programs, but we also saw artistic exchanges, journalism fellowships, all sorts of other types of exchanges and partnerships that would allow for other private sector projects to really blossom in Cuba in these different sectors. Thanks in part to these inflows of support, we saw private business owners and employees become real important new voices in Cuban society, advocating for further economic reform. Anyone here who has had regular interaction with entrepreneurs on the island know that there is no shortage of complaints that they have about having inspectors breathing down their necks and laws being unclear as to what kind of activity is permissible and not, and access to basic procurements and other materials that they need in order to be able to not only manage their businesses but scale their businesses. And they have become very vocal in that regard, constantly working with them, engaging Cuban officials to allow them greater space and greater flexibility to operate their ventures. We also saw during this time the emergence of a more dynamic, diverse sphere of digital independent media in Cuba, including sites dedicated to investigative reporting. We saw these sites take off during this period of pretty strong private sector engagement. Many of the sites that are being attacked today by the Cuban government as not being independent media, sites that were once considered to be sort of in the gray zone, so not exactly dissident but not state either, but independent, that are now the target of much of the Cuban state propaganda. Again, these sites were launched during this period, and it was with the support of private actors abroad. So that is something that is nothing to sneeze at. But moving on to the missed opportunities of this era, and there were many. Cuba didn't take advantage of Detained to sufficiently deepen domestic reforms, and was very slow to respond to many of the opportunities that engagement provided. You know, Cuba for a long time used U.S. hostility as a pretext for not reforming aspects of its system, economic, political, and other. And now that you had a United States that was engaging Cuba, that had renounced a policy of regime change, that was willing to work with Cuba to normalize relations and to improve things on the island and to make investments in its economy, Cuba nonetheless was too slow to act. Dozens of American companies that flocked to Havana in 2000, particularly in 2015 and 16, seeking opportunities created by these modest new allowances in investment under U.S. law, the ones I mentioned earlier, into both Cuba's private sector and state sector, were rebuffed by Cuban officials. You heard this time and again, companies, American companies that went there with genuine interest in seeing if there's an opportunity to establish some sort of beachhead in the Cuban market, and the Cubans and the Cuban officials being very slow to respond or forcing them to only sign MOUs. Probably the most high profile case of these was Google. Despite significant overtures by the Google team, you saw Cuba nonetheless turn to Chinese technology giants like Huawei to help build out its information and communications technology infrastructure. And while the Cuban private sector did flourish with the increased number of U.S. visitors during this time, it was still throughout all this tightly constrained as to what areas of the economy it could operate and how much they can grow, and in terms of wealth generation. It wasn't just wealth accumulation, it was wealth generation that the Cuban government was really putting the brakes on. Despite including personalidad jurídica for small and medium-sized enterprises in the 2016 Communist Party Congress documents, Cuban officials nonetheless balked at granting cuentapropistas legal recognition that they needed to access import and export channels directly at the time, or to accept foreign investment legally. This is despite efforts by many U.S. institutions, groups, and individuals to try to help the Cuban private sector. By mid-2016, the expectations unleashed by President Obama's visit within Cuba and pressures on centralized control that were created by closer relation with the United States, whether real or perceived, did lead government hardliners in Cuba to start characterizing engagement policy as regime change by other means. They were just saying that this was another way of the United States trying to topple the Cuban government. State media even started referring to entrepreneurs as los hijos de Obama, and not in a good way, in a disparaging way, as if they were another form of a Trojan horse soldier that was being trained and to one day be mobilized within Cuban society. We saw conferences such as Startup Week in Havana, which is sponsored by Dell and other U.S. tech companies, canceled without cause by Cuban officials, as well as the website for the 10 by 10K Cuba contest for tech entrepreneurs, which I helped organize, blocked on the island to make it harder for Cuban entrepreneurs to apply. By no means am I citing these as major events. I only mention them to note how even harmless, privately organized gatherings to really showcase product and provide networking opportunities for Cuban entrepreneurs had by this point become national security concerns within the eyes of some of the more conservative types in the Cuban government. We fast forward a little now into the Trump years, to August 2017 to December sorry, that should be 18, not 19, to December of 18. Cuban government froze all cuentapropista licenses in most of the most productive sectors in Cuba, which led to a lot of frustration on the island because it made it harder for many of those entrepreneurs to grow their businesses. And in 2019, when the new constitution acknowledged that there were new forms of private property in Cuba, it did nonetheless kick binding economic changes like the legalization of small and medium-sized enterprises further down the road. We saw that recognition and really what we hope are the initial steps towards remedying that in July 2020, when the Cuban government finally announced that it will move forward with several long-stalled pieces of its previously approved roadmap for economic reforms. This includes expanding space for Cuba's, expanding space of activity in practice for Cuba's non-state sector, legalizing small and medium-sized enterprises on the island, as well as advancing currency reform, which we know just began this month. Another thing, however, that drove much frustration on this side of the Florida Straits was the under-recognized importance of remittances for the Cuban economy in helping to, in really helping to buoy that economy, as well as the ongoing grievances that that many here in the United States continue to harbor when looking at Cuba's closed political system and its sclerotic economy. We ourselves saw this in many focus groups and interviews that we conducted in South Florida, where it came up time and again among Cuban recién llegados, and by that I mean post-94 arrivals, even though many of them are not son recién anymore, but still we haven't come up with a better term. But many of the people that supported the Obama opening, that traveled to Cuba, that support businesses on the island, were nonetheless really frustrated with the slow pace of reform in Cuba and beginning to side with Trump and to support resource denial policies once more. They saw it as a tightening the screws on the regime as a way to possibly get the regime to start loosening up again and allowing for real opportunities for Cubans on the island to reintegrate themselves and to invest in their own country. Other reforms that the Cuban government has been slow to implement, even despite repeated requests by the private sector here in the United States, particularly Cuban Americans in the United States and in other countries, and Cuban immigrants in other countries that are also interested in integrating themselves into Cuban society and its economy, are many migratory reforms. This includes lifting residency requirements for investing or allowing Cubans abroad to invest legally in the island's private sector, as well as political participation, homogenizing migrant categories so that those that left during a particular period are not treated differently than those that left in subsequent periods, the reduction of passport fees, which we know are the most expensive in the world and remain so, and so on. In conclusion, what all this means is that during this period of private sector engagement of the Obama opening, normalization did not achieve enough, particularly in terms of U.S. commercial engagement or Cuban American reintegration into Cuban society, to really create constituencies in the United States deep enough to resist political support for a return to resource denial policy under the Trump administration. For U.S.-Cuba relations to truly deepen during the Biden years, as we look ahead, both sides are going to need to be proactive. Certainly, there are steps that the Biden administration should take unilaterally to restore support for the Cuban people as a policy priority and reverse much of the damage that has been wrought under the Trump administration. But it's also very important that Cuba do its part. And what I mean by Cuba doing its part is that whether it's as a result of negotiations, of parallel measures, or internal reforms, Cuba take advantage of these next 4 years to allow for greater compatibility between its affairs and U.S. private interests to really take hold. This means allowing for greater legal U.S. investment, particularly in the Cuban private sector, improving or even normalizing relations with the Cuban diaspora, and further liberalizing its economy, right? This is to say nothing of more substantive political reforms. But these steps will be necessary in order to really generate constituencies on the U.S. that can serve as a bulwark against future politically driven efforts at a policy rollback. As Gary and others have recognized, insisting on all or nothing conditionality or strict quid pro quos will not work with the Cubans. There's a whole historical record of those efforts proving fruitless. But in truth, for progress to really take hold, process is going to be less important than results. What is important is that meaningful changes be allowed to happen and to bloom into resilient social economic ties in order for relations to really stick.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. I have a question now for several of you who have touched on the subject, and that is, does Trump's win of the Cuban American vote in Florida and its contribution to winning Florida What does that do in terms of Biden's hands on whether it ties Biden's hands or loosens Biden's hands in terms of its policy towards Cuba and of its administration? What is the impact of that? I'd be interested to know. I know I've heard there's different opinions.
I mean, for one, it does matter in terms of Congress because there are right now, I think currently more Cuban members of Congress than there have been in the past, especially with the new ones that came in South Florida as part of with the last election when, Republicans essentially won South Florida. So that's going to be important that way, especially because Rubio is still going to be on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and so on. But one thing that is pretty consistent with the historical research I've been doing from Reagan up to now is that the presidents really focus on not really rocking the boat with Cuban Americans in their first term. I mean, even Obama, it wasn't until the second half of his second term that he instituted the thaw policies. So if Biden is looking toward re-election, which may or may not be, or maybe he is just looking for a Democrat to be reelected in 4 years, he may kind of lean into those hardline policies, but he probably isn't going to feel as much duty to, or feel like he has to repay the Cuban American community, unlike how Trump did.
Rick,
if I can chime in on this one.
Yes, please.
I've heard many friends say that, well, now because the Cuban American vote went for Trump, Biden owes nothing to them. And we can finally now shift U.S. Cuba policy to one that is dictated by U.S. national interest and not by domestic politics. We really wish that were the case. I think, however, that remains more of an aspirational goal than a reflection of current realities. The fact is that 2022 is around the corner already in political terms, and Florida is going to be in play. Marco Rubio is up for re-election. Ron DeSantis, the governor, is up for re-election. Because of redistricting, you're going to have 2 new congressional seats added to the state, and one of them will likely end up in Miami-Dade. So it's very possible that Miami-Dade may end up with 4 members of Congress representing it. So it would be unrealistic to think that the Democrats aren't going to play for these seats and that Cuba policy won't be a factor because as we saw in 2020, the Republican Party in Florida has tailored its entire messaging around the idea of staving off Cuban and Venezuela-style socialism from reaching the shores of the United States, and on the idea of tightening the screws on these governments. And we saw it work well for them in the 2020 elections. And it worked well for them also to a degree in the 2018 elections. There's no real reason to think that they're going to, stop doing what works for them. So I think that the smarter, the real sort of the more prudent approach, smarter and more prudent approach, is really to integrate the Cuban American community into this sort of reset of engagement policy. There is still a lot of support within that community for elements of engagement, particularly all of the ones that Biden already announced and committed to during his campaign. But it is hard to see him spending any political capital within the next 2 years to try to move Congress, even if Democrats take control of the Senate, to loosen codified sanctions. That political capital will have to be generated. And for that political capital to be generated, Cuba is going to have to do its part. The more that Cuban Americans and others see here real opportunities to invest in Cuba, the more that Cuban Americans see opportunities to really reintegrate themselves into Cuba society in a transparent way, in a way that they feel is appreciated by Cuban officials, the less resistance you're going to see here, or at least the less support you will see for resource denial policies. Because you will have now Cubans in the United States actively pursuing real opportunities to get ahead within their own country of birth. And that will have serious impact on public opinion down south.
Well, one thing, one kind of caveat, or maybe a question I pose as well, is the media atmosphere in South Florida is something to kind of look at. It used to be pretty much the Spanish language radio stations that really boosted the rhetoric. But now it's, there's still some of that, especially in the older crowd, but you also have TV stations, and you also have these up and coming YouTube stars that seem to be very, very popular, especially among newer arrivals. I mean, the newest FIU Cuba poll showed that very recent arrivals were much more strongly in favor of hardline, or at least in the past couple of years than they were before. I mean, it just drastically changed, as kind of you're talking about. So the question is, how much will the media environment make a difference when it comes to attitudes toward if Biden wanted to kind of continue on what Obama did?
Paolo and Gary, do you want to read Mrinalini?
Well, I think Carolyn and Ricardo both expressed my views fairly strongly. That's why I argue that, the policy is going to have to be slow. It really, I think, has to be tailored to what happens on the island. I think one of the failures of the Obama administration, it was trying to push things before Cuba was ready for it. I have an example. There's a lawyer who's a part of ASCE who was trying to represent U.S. firms looking to invest in Cuba. He talked to the State Department, this is during the Obama years, and asking what the criteria was. And basically I told, look, we'll take any criteria. Just give us something so we can approve it. That's not a policy that works. It's just not. So you really have to be careful. It means actually you can have some better staffing at the State Department so we can get these things looked at more carefully. But when Cuba does things right, we want to make it to succeed. And so at that point, we should move. Trying with Congress, trying with Mario and others, with pre-consultations, not after the fact consultations, to try to get them on, and understanding you won't get them on all the time, and move forward. I mean, a successful foreign policy, especially to Cuba, depends on domestic support.
Paolo and Mrinalini, did you want to add anything, or shall I go on to other questions? Paolo, you're muted.
Okay, something quickly. If we look at the economic and political reforms in Cuba, the depth and pace, there's plenty of reason to be disappointed. So in terms of US policy being responsive to what happens in Cuba, as I said, there are plenty of reasons not to do things. But if we look at the last 30 years and how meaningful changes happen in Cuba, it always happened at a moment when there was more engagement with the island, whether the engagement came from the European or the engagement came from the US or came from another place. So still we are here. I'm skeptical too that the Biden administration will not be implemented, especially in the short term, meaningful changes. But if we look at 2022, 2024, the logic of US policy toward Cuba never really responded to changes on the island, and mostly responded to domestic political imperatives. And I think it's time to disassociate the two, to have a policy that is proactive and does build bridges with Cuba, because that has been the lesson in the past 30 years. And again, I'm the first one to be critical of the lack of depth and the reforms they need to do but that always helped better than the policy of isolation and putting more restriction. I think the Mrinalini presentation was really emblematic, excellent presentation to show how difficult it is to establish relationship with Cuba. Cuba tried the U-turn transaction, it didn't work. Cubans cannot open correspondent account in US bank. The whole financial transaction system is problematic, and there are so many areas. So at some point, the United States, I think it should take a proactive and give it some time to promote and encourage some meaningful change in Cuba. Otherwise, if we try to look at the US logic and the reason for not doing things, you will always find plenty.
Yeah, I would only add to that, I do agree. Again, both sides need to be proactive. Being proactive doesn't come at the expense of public opinion. We saw during the Obama years that the Obama administration was incredibly proactive in engaging Cuba, and we saw the policy was very popular. It was reflected in poll after poll in the Cuban American community, and in particularly in South Florida. We saw, Hillary went and gave a big speech on Cuba policy down there in 2015, and then later on went to win record turnout for a Democrat within the Cuban American vote in 2016. So it's not about, to Gary's point, with which I differ a little bit, it's not about being slow, waiting for the Cubans to do everything. You have to proactively engage the Cubans and try to enable these changes that they need to, that we need to see on the other side, not because we're insisting on these changes, but it's because no one understands the reality in Cuba like Cubans at home and Cubans abroad. And for the politics to change in Florida, public opinion will have to shift. And you can have all the YouTubers in the world. It doesn't matter. You can have Paolo on primetime TV, not just on YouTube every day in Miami. If Cuba opens up its economy, allows for real investment in the private sector, normalizes its relations with the diaspora to a significant degree, incentivizes diaspora investment, those are real changes. No YouTube celebrity or influencer is going to be able to manage public opinion if those real changes take place. But those changes need to occur if we want relations to really become resilient to the whims of US politics. Because the real threat here is that we are very engaged, we are very proactive. We lift all these Trump measures. We really push to have increase U.S. presence and socioeconomic ties, but not enough happens on the Cuban side. And the Cuban people don't really perceive a change and are still riddled with the same grievances that drove resource denial policy during the Trump years. We'll see then, we'll be back to a policy of resource denial next time you have a Republican in the White House. And that could be very well be in 4 years. We don't know what's going to happen in 2024.
Let me just add, a second.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should not engage with Cuba. I absolutely think we should engage with Cuba at an active scale, but not with big announcements. We should be talking to the Cubans privately. We should point out we are willing to help in their reforms, that we will react positively. We will react positively to their reforms that we think will work. You will see changes in our embargo. You will see changes in remittance policy. You'll change a lot of things. But let's not make a big thing of it, which, as I think Ricardo is very good at pointing out, just creates expectations that can be disappointed at home. That neither helps U.S. policy nor helps Cuba.
Okay, let me give Mrinalini a chance to comment. She's been trying to and has not been able to get a word in.
No, thank you, Natalia. I think this is obviously a very complicated issue, and I also completely support reaching out and being proactive about engagement with Cuba and not following a kind of isolationist policy. But I think, at least from my work, one of the things that I've noticed is that even when there are shifts, like Paolo mentioned, with the shifts in banking relations, right? There are apertures that get opened up, but there is a weight of history, right? There's a weight of history that still doesn't allow for engagement by Cubans in sort of global systems, right? And there's sort of, you know, there is an asymmetry in who can enact change, right, on a kind of global, on a global scale between these two, between the two sides. And so I feel like even when these changes, for example, with the banking relations happened, you know, international companies and the international environment, or the international sort of community, still doesn't sort of acknowledge or you know, stay true to those reforms, because they're worried that they're going to be penalized by the sanctions, or they're going to be repercussions, right? And so so I feel like there is that kind of weight, even when there is engagement, and those are not kind of fully followed through, those the policies. It sort of it sets us back further. So so yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily fall on either side, but and I'm going to defer to the Cubans and Cuban Americans on the panel about this, but yeah.
Let me ask you a related question that came in the Q&A queue, and it's from Michael Strauss. He says, in terms of missed opportunities, might US sanctions also be responsible for missed opportunities within and outside Cuba that might be initiated by Cuba's private sector? For example, Zoom's terms of service exclude its use in Cuba. Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I absolutely. You know, the challenge here is that for Cuba to provide opportunities, it somehow still needs to manage to get around the embargo, or at least reduce its exposure to embargo sanctions. One thing that the embargo, at least codified under Helms-Burton, didn't really anticipate was the growth of the private sector. Part of the reason why you saw such a focus during the Obama years in investment of the private sector is not just because it's something that we support from, you know, in terms of American values and beliefs, but also it's where the opportunities were to really build and strengthen economic ties between the two countries. But you saw a lot of resistance on the Cuban side saying, oh, no, you can't just invest in our private sector. Look at our beautiful state sector and all the other offerings we have here. And look at our carpeta of inversiones. Why don't you put money in that? And there just wasn't interest, because those investments were exposed to codified sanctions. If there had been a more strategic mindset at play that recognized that by allowing for greater investment in the private sector, you would cement that relationship to a much greater degree, I think we may not be where we are now in terms of relations. But certainly things like the Zoom terms and other issues, I think that to the degree that can be identified during the Biden, once the Biden administration comes in, and folks can identify certain regulatory tweaks that could be made to further facilitate trade with the Cuban private sector, and bring those to the attention of OFAC and Commerce. I think that would be very helpful for those entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, Rick, in response to you. And I think that one of the problems is that even if you didn't have sanctions and you allowed American multinational companies, the ones that would be able to make significant real capital investments in Cuba, they're not going to do it in the public sector. And they're not going to do it in the public sector for a series of reasons that have to do with things that are totally non-political, but it has to do with their accounting, their reporting requirements, all sorts of other issues, which I don't think that we focus enough on. So actually, I'm planning to do a panel on this at some point in the next few weeks, but I think it would be helpful for everybody to understand the limitations of doing business with the Cuban state sector. It's very hard for an American company to do that. And the investments that have occurred so far are really like minimal. I mean, they're like the kinds of investments that don't even get booked on their balance sheets because they're totally discounted as valueless. So I just think that's a real challenge. Anyway, I don't know, Paolo, if you wanted to add anything, because you did have something, an earlier question on Banco Financiera. I don't know if you wanted to.
I wanted to add something here. I was going to give a publicity boost to Natalia's planned panel. Hopefully it'll be in late February. We're going to have a lot of good people, and it's really going to focus on what Cuba needs to do to make a proper investment environment. So we're looking forward to that, Natalia.
I'm sorry, Rick and Paolo, both of you look like you want to say something.
I'll be quickly. On Banco Financiero, it's the same situation with FinCEMEX and remittances. It's the US government forcing Cuba to change how they do business with a different company not tied to the military. So in my case, I think the biggest problem from US standpoint is the lack of realism in terms of expectation, what Cuba can or will do. If we consider 2014 as the time when the Obama administration started to improve relations with Cuba, that was also the time where practically the entire reform process led by Raul Castro had practically stalled, because the whole process stalled on the reform of the state enterprise sector. There is where the biggest changes are needed and where Cuba is resisting the changes. If the Obama, for instance, would have done the same 5 years before, in 2009, when he liberalized the restriction on Cuban Americans, also on Americans traveling to Cuba, you would have praised Cuba for doing all the things they've done up to that point. So I'm thinking that sometimes the process of changing Cuba has its own dynamic and its own pace. So the best way is to engage, of course, trying to expect something, but not to have unrealistic expectation. As soon as they don't happen, the public opinion is ready to move the other way, because that's always what happens in Cuba and what happened after 2014. And by 2017, the mood was, you can look at all the FIU polls and you can see how over time the support for the embargo was waning, and then all of a sudden the support is still there. So if you look at what Cuba is doing, you have plenty of reason again to be disappointed. But at the end, the best way is always to start an engagement process and then eventually make adjustment down the road. We also have to remember that the whole embargo is codified. So even the autonomy in terms of US policy, what Biden can do or Trump could do before, is limited. So at the end, I think there must be a process of trying to engage more than trying to put condition and expecting things in return, because that is not going to happen, at least under the current condition.
Does anybody want to add anything? I see some faces that look.
I had a question for the other panelists. I keep hearing about the early part of the Obama administration. There was the increased connections and possibilities in telecommunications and internet, social media connections. But did anything come out of that? I mean, are there any agreements now between U.S. companies and the Cuban media?
Roaming.
There's an MOU with Google, but we don't really know what's come of it.
Okay.
But there is development of the internet, but who's developing it, Rick? Maybe you can, or Paolo can comment on that. Social media has exploded in Cuba. The question is by whom?
Much of it is on Chinese infrastructure, but it's all U.S. It's not all, but you know they do use WeChat in Cuba, but not as much as Facebook or WhatsApp or any of the apps. The dominant apps in the United States, and the dominant app in Cuba are still of U.S. origin and are likely to remain as such. Not just the apps, but the operating systems on which Cubans themselves build those apps.
So I don't have any more questions from on the Q&A that I don't think that have not been answered. Does anybody else have anything to add? Otherwise, I think we could probably wrap up this panel. If you speak up, if you have something.
Thanking the chair.
Pardon me?
I want to thank the chair.
Well, I want to thank you all really for your presentations and, really making yourself available on a very last minute notice for the prep session thank you for your insights, and I hope to stay in touch with all of you. And I look forward to maintaining our network going forward. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today. And, Happy New Year. Let's hope it's a much better one.
You're here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.